Yes.
Yes, okay, cool. If you don't know what a martyr is, just real quick, comes from the Greek word that means witness, and it's used to describe people who are killed for their faith. More colloquially, it can be used to describe somebody who is ridiculed or ostracized for their faith, not necessarily killed. Cool. Now, you guys know a ton of martyrs. These are pretty much all the ones that everyone talks about. We have St. Andrew, St. Joan of Arc, St. Sebastian, St. Peter, etc., etc. I'm not going to talk about these guys because everyone and their moms already talks about them. I actually want to talk about the martyrs that aren't as talked about. Now, Jasmine said I could do 3, but I couldn't decide, and I put 7 in this presentation. So what I actually want to do is I want to let you guys, my dear audience, decide which ones I talk about. So I suppose I'll let you guys discuss it for a little bit and decide the 3 that you really want to hear, the ones that catch your eyes the most.
The Jewish nun.
Yeah.
She looks kind of scary.
The brightness go down.
The 26th one.
That'd be automatic brightness.
Oh yeah, I made catchy titles for all of them, so like maybe that'll entice you a little bit.
Oh, I thought that was her actual name. I was like, oh, they never figured it out.
I'd say that.
Is it? It's dim, isn't it? Hey Jasmine, is there a way to turn up the brightness on the TV?
The longer remote, and then you can kind of play with the settings there.
I can't see it. I'm blind.
Let's learn about the samurai.
I hope so. Like the first one. Like, I've never had one of these. No.
A remote.
No, but can I see it?
I just like put my name inside
Maybe it's just a
of
slide,
it.
you
Oh,
know?
no way.
Yeah.
I have a small one.
Yeah.
Mine's mine's like a little too big. Well, I have 2. I have this one right now, and then I have this one. It's like sweet stuff. This one's not.
Yeah.
That's too bright.
Oh, yeah.
Well, it sucks.
I'd rather have it too bright than not bright enough. So yeah, there we go. Did you guys come up with the 3 that you wanted me to talk about?
The Jewish nun.
The Jewish nun? I'm hearing the Jewish nun. Everyone wants the Jewish nun?
Faith and resilience. I'm down with that one.
Okay. Why don't we do? We'll do this by raising of hands because this is a little too inefficient. If you guys want me to talk about the 3 young boys, would you please raise your hand? 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, 4. That seems like not many. What about the 26?
Can we vote for multiple?
Yes, you can vote for multiple. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. 13, okay, we got 13 there. What about heretic I never was? 1, 2, 3. Sad. 4. No. Faith and resilience. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14.
And then the Jewish nun is next.
What about killed in odium fide?
It doesn't stand for the KKK?
4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. 9, that's a pretty good turnout. Did someone raise their hand back there? 10? No? No? Okay. The Jewish nun. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, and I think 15. Okay, so I think we're starting to see our clear winners here. Last but not least, my departure is at hand. 1, 2, 3. Okay, 3. Sad. All right. So 4 winners, Jasmine.
The second one that you named, is it the 20-something?
The 26?
Yes.
Okay.
Right? And then faith and resilience.
Oh, that one is very interesting, and I
And
cannot
then
wait to talk
the
about it.
Jewish nun.
The Jewish nun.
Those are the
Okay.
top 3.
How sad. I wanted to talk about this guy right here. That's for another day. So I suppose everyone wants to hear about the 26 first and foremost. So we'll go ahead and talk about St. Paul Miki and the 25 other martyrs of Japan. I had here a little bit of information about St. Paul Miki, about when he was canonized and what his patronage is. So we'll go ahead and talk about him. Now, if you guys have attended my presentations before, you know that I love to give historical context and I love to talk about history. So we're going to go ahead and talk about the historical context, missionaries in the Sengoku period. So in 1549, Francis Xavier, who would later be canonized as a saint, would go to missions into East Asia, namely China and in Japan, right? And so because of the missionary activity of the Jesuits and the Franciscans in Japan, the city of Nagasaki becomes a hub for Catholicism. And this works to the advantage of the missionaries because Nagasaki is also a port city. Now, at the peak of Catholicism during this time period, there are as many as 300,000 Japanese kirishikans, which this is a word that specifically refers to Japanese Catholics in this period. There's words to describe Christians in general, but the word kirishikan specifically describes Japanese Catholics during the Sengoku and the Edo periods. The Imperial Japanese government at first supported the missions of the Catholic Church, but this wasn't out of the kindness of their hearts. They wanted to support the Catholic Church because they believed that the Catholic Church would subvert the power of the Buddhist temples, right? They didn't like that the Buddhist temples had too much power because it took away from their own power, and so they wanted to support the Catholic Church and its missions so that the Buddhist temples would have less power, right? Eventually, when the Catholic influence was starting to get a little too high, Catholicism was outlawed. And in 1585, Toyotomi Hideyoshi unifies Japan in the late Sengoku period, which the Sengoku period is 100 years of constant conflict over control in Japan, right? And Hideyoshi outlaws Catholicism, bans missionary, but he does this while also trying to maintain trade relations with Spain and Portugal, which Spain and Portugal are pretty much known for not liking to trade with people who mess with Catholicism, right? So that's our historical context for this. So now we'll talk about Paul Miki. So Paul Miki was born to an affluent family in Osaka in 1562. Now this wasn't necessarily a weird thing. Now because we are more familiar with the Franciscans, we know that the Franciscans, their strategy to evangelize and to convert is to speak with people who are poorer, who are lower class, etc., etc. But the strategy of the Jesuits is actually quite different, and it actually pretty much the exact opposite. What the Jesuits would do is that they would try to convert people who had a lot of influence and a lot of power, because then when the people who had influence and power would convert to Catholicism, the people that they influenced would be more likely to convert as well. That was the strategy of the Jesuits. So St. Paul Miki converted to Catholicism as a child, as did his parents. He entered the Jesuit seminary in Azuchi at age 20, and he joined the Jesuits. Another thing, the Franciscans and the Jesuits were sponsored by different countries. The Franciscans were sponsored by Spain, which is also why you see a lot of like Franciscan activity in Latin America, and the Jesuits were sponsored by Portugal. And he was noted for being quite the eloquent speaker. So his homilies were very like poetic, and he knew how to talk to people, essentially. And he successfully converted thousands of Buddhists to Christianity. And he was about 2 months from being ordained a priest before he was arrested. So now we're going to talk about the San Felipe incident that happened in 1596. So in 1596, a Spanish trading ship called the San Felipe was shipwrecked in Shikoku, and the local daimyo seized the cargo. Now, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, who was the guy who was in control at the time, he suspected that this was an attempt at Spanish infiltration and conquest based on the comments of a Spanish captain, right? So based on the comments of this Spanish captain, Hideyoshi Toyotomi suspected that the Spanish were trying to infiltrate and conquer Japan. And so what he did was he ordered that all Spanish Franciscans be rounded up and be prepared for, execution, right? For one reason or another, we don't really know why, the Japanese authorities also arrested 4 Jesuits, which included St. Paul Miki, even though the order was only to arrest Spanish Franciscans. It was 3 Jesuits. So the 2 other ones were John de Goto, who was another Japanese priest, and James Kisai, who was a Japanese lay brother. So he was part of the Jesuits, but he wasn't a priest. He was a lay brother. None of the Jesuits were in any way affiliated with Spain. So here's where we get to his martyrdom. In January 1597, 26 Catholics were arrested, tortured, and mutilated. The group included 4 Spaniards, 1 priest from New Spain, 1 priest from Portugal, and 20 Japanese. And out of all of those guys, 20 of them were Franciscans, 3 were Jesuits, and 3 were altar boys. The soon-to-be martyrs were paraded throughout the Japanese villages in an attempt to humiliate them. And on February 5th, the group was forced to march some 600 miles all the way back to Nagasaki. But they didn't really lose hope. Instead, they were singing songs of praise and notably the Te Deum before they were crucified. So Paul Miki gave his last homily while he was hanging from a Japanese cross. And while he was giving his last homily, he was also speared, hit with the spear in his chest. A little familiar, isn't it? And his dying words were that he proclaimed forgiveness for his executioners. So yeah, that's St. Paul Miki. Who else? Who was it?
Faith and resilience.
Oh, Faith and Resilience. Oh man, I've been waiting for this one.
Before you start, Ricky,
Yes.
I know Nagasaki was like a really big Catholic hub.
Mm-hmm.
Why did they choose that to nuke? You think that was like anti-Catholic? That seems like very like suspicious.
It
that
seems
was a very
suspicious at
Catholic-
first. It seems suspicious at first, but the real reason is because Nagasaki was a port city. So it was very economically important to Japan during the Second World War because it was a port. It was right next to where all the stuff got shipped. You know, I don't like to think that.
I don't think that either, but I just think
Yeah,
that's
I mean
funky.
it's like you think about it for a second. You know, the United States has a history of like anti-Catholic sentiment, so like it would make sense, but I don't think that's what actually happened. So you guys chose Faith and Resilience. We're going to talk here about Blessed Miguel Pro, also a Jesuit. His full name right here, Jose Ramon Miguel Agustin Pro Juarez. Mexican names, am I right? He was beatified in 1988 by John Paul II, and his feast is the 23rd of November. So this one will require a lot of historical context. Like, I can't even do it justice, just like 2 slides of me talking about pure history right here. So, for historical context, we're going to start with the Mexican Revolution. The Mexican Revolution started in 1910 and happened because of Porfirio Diaz, who was the liberal president. He was part of the Liberal Party, but he was the dictator of Mexico. And what he was doing essentially was taking land from poor peasants and giving them to his rich friends, essentially turning the peasants into kind of like serfs, right? So, in the Constitution, in the Mexican Constitution during this time, there was a lot of anti-clerical laws, right? And this goes back to the War of Reform with Benito Juarez, because Benito Juarez wanted to privatize a lot of communal land that was owned by indigenous people and land that was owned by the church. So Benito Juarez took a lot of land from indigenous people to privatize it because he wanted to economically grow just like the United States. And he did the same thing with the lands owned by the church as well. So in response to Porfirio Diaz never really like enforced these anti-clerical articles in the Constitution. But after the Mexican Revolution, Porfirio Diaz stepped down as the dictator of Mexico, and a new president was elected that also didn't really enforce the anti-clerical articles in the Constitution, and a new political party was formed, the National Catholic Party, and this party pursued, of course, Catholic interests. So Francisco Madero was elected in November 1911, and he was assassinated in a military coup led by General Victoriano Huerta, who was a supporter of Diaz, right? So government officials at this point are now suspicious that the National Catholic Party, as well as high-ranking church officials, were somehow involved in the assassination of Madero. And so Venustiano Carranza takes the presidency, and his faction draws up the new Constitution of 1917, which strengthened the anti-clerical articles. Now, despite the fact that he strengthened the anti-clerical articles, they still weren't really enforced, right? So now here's where we get to post-revolution and the Cristero War. So Carranza's successor, Alvaro Obregón, was too busy to enforce the anti-clerical articles. Now here's where we get this guy right here, Plutarco Elias Calles, which is Obregón's successor. He really enforced these anti-clerical measures in the Constitution. Now, what did these anti-clerical Constitution articles entail? They entailed the prohibition of worship in public, the prohibition of priests from wearing their habits or their garb out in public, all religious activity must be inside the church. So, you can't go onto the street, you can't pray in public, things of that sort. The church was also not allowed to own land. Priests were not allowed to inherit wealth. So, for example, let's say like a priest has a rich best friend, and that rich best friend died, leaves everything to the priest. The government would say, nope, that's ours now, essentially. So he enacted these new anti-Catholic laws banning public expression of religion. This also included other religions as well, such as Lutheranism, but because Mexico was such a and still is such a heavily Catholic country, this mostly affected Catholics, right? Gaius saw the Catholic Church as a threat and initially sought to limit the church's influence, but then eventually opted to destroy the Catholic Church and impose atheism within the government, right? So the Mexican Catholic Apostolic Church, which is a heretical and schismatic group, is founded in 1925 by a Freemason and former Catholic priest who declared himself the quote-unquote patriarch of the new national church. This group supported the anti-clerical laws, which is really weird if you think about it, because this is supposedly a religious group that is supporting anti-religious laws. Really activates the almonds there a little bit. In 1926, tens of thousands of civilians at first were peacefully protesting the anti-clerical laws. And when the government ended up essentially using violence on its own citizens, that's when the Cristeros rose up and started taking up arms themselves. So now we get to Miguel Agustin Pro. So he joined the Jesuit seminary and studied in Mexico until 1914. And he was noted for his wit and his happy demeanor. So this guy was like pretty witty and very smart. And he was also very cheerful. In 1914, he flees to California because of persecution by the Mexican government. In 1915, he decides to continue his studies, but in Spain. In 1919, he works as a teacher in Nicaragua, and in 1922, he's sent to Belgium to continue his studies and is ordained a priest. What's interesting about his activities in Belgium is that he worked with a group of miners, right? People who like collect minerals and resources and such. And this group of miners in Belgium were very, very leftist. They were communists, they were anarchists, they were socialists, but they grew so much on Miguel Pro, like they loved Miguel Pro so much that they actually decided to convert to Catholicism. And in 1926, he is planning to go back to Mexico, but before he does, he goes to Lourdes, France, and visits the grotto of Our Lady of Lourdes before finally returning to Mexico. He celebrates Mass in Lourdes. So here's where his arrest comes in, right? Former President Alvaro Obregón is injured during an assassination attempt, right? 1927. And the state uses this as a pretext to arrest more Catholic priests and more Catholic faithful, right? Now, despite the confession of a young engineer, Miguel Pro is not released, and they do not declare his innocence. In fact, they double down and say, you're still guilty, right? So he was sentenced to die by firing squad under the order of President Gaius, right? So Gaius ordered the execution to be photographed precisely because he wanted to intimidate the Cristeros. Like he wanted to distribute them in newspapers and say, this is what's going to happen to you if you keep following Catholicism. This actually had the opposite effect, and it really like emboldened the Cristeros even more. It motivated them to fight even harder. So kind of a dumb move on Gaius's part. So here we have the photos of Miguel Pro's martyrdom. His final words were recorded as him saying, may God have mercy on you, may God bless you. Lord, thou knowest I am innocent. With all my heart I forgive my enemies. And then he proceeds to shout, Viva Cristo Rey, which means long live Christ the King. And he is shot by firing squad while holding a crucifix in one hand and a rosary in the other. He doesn't die by firing squad. He's laying on the ground in this picture right here. He's still alive in this picture. In this picture right here, he is still alive. So this guy right here, he's a Mexican soldier. He deals the mercy killing, deals the final blow, and Miguel Pro is dead. That's the story of Miguel Pro. Kind of depressing. Who's next? Jewish nun? Was Jewish nun?
Yeah.
Okay. Saint Teresa Benedicta of the Cross, born Edith Stein, canonized 1998 by John Paul II. Her patronage includes Europe. She's one of the, 8 co-patrons of Europe. And she's also the patron saint of converted Jews. So here's our historical context. Nazi domination over Germany. In 1933, the Enabling Act was passed in Germany. And this effectively made Adolf Hitler the absolute ruler of Germany, the dictator of Germany. Hitler could do whatever he wanted now because that was the law that was passed. Anti-Semitic laws were enacted in Germany, as well as laws that restricted non-governmental institutions. Because in the eyes of the Nazis, anything that wasn't directly by the government was illegitimate. And this included churches, right? Churches and media, etc., independent media, etc. In 1934, 30% of Catholic priests were arrested by Nazi authorities, and this is just in Germany we're talking about. 30% of Catholic priests in Germany were arrested in 1 year, that's a lot. 1937, Pope Pius I don't know Roman numerals. What is that?
11.
11? Yes, thank you. Pope Pius, oh that's right, because it was 12. Okay. Pope Pius XI attempts to convince Hitler to allow religious freedom for Catholics, and this doesn't work. It works for a little bit. He's like, okay, fine. I'll let Catholics do their thing on the condition that priests don't talk about politics and that they don't criticize the Nazi party, right? But the Catholics were still subject to heavy surveillance by Nazi authorities, and Catholic newspapers and youth groups Catholic newspapers were shut down, and Catholic youth groups were banned, essentially, right? Because the only youth group that the Nazis wanted was the Hitler Youth, right? Pius XI issues his encyclical, I can't read German, but it translates to "with burning anxiety." And in this encyclical, Pius XI condemns racism, and he calls it neo-paganism, he calls it idolatry of the state, and he also condemns what he calls the myth of race and blood. In this encyclical, he also condemns the treatment of Catholics and the treatment of Jews. Now we get to Edith Stein. So here's a quick summary of Edith Stein's life. She was born on Yom Kippur in 1891 to an observant Orthodox Jewish family. She declared herself an atheist when she was a teenager, and she entered the University of Breslau to study philosophy and psychology in 1911. She became the first woman in that university to complete her doctorate. So that's already a pretty impressive feat. This was a very impressive woman. In 1921, she reads Saint Teresa of Avila's autobiography, and this seemed to have a profound effect on her because her reading Teresa of Avila's autobiography is what caused her to convert to Catholicism, and it also caused her to join the Carmelite order. So she becomes a lecturer at the Scientific Institute of Pedagogy in Münster, but is forced to resign because the Nazis passed a law stating that ethnic Jews are not allowed to hold teaching positions, right? And this includes Edith Stein. She's a Jewish woman who converts to Catholicism. So she writes a letter to Pius XI warning that the persecution of Jews is a forerunner to the persecution of Christians. In 1933, this is when she joins the Carmelite order, and she takes on the religious name Teresa Benedicta of the Cross. And if you couldn't tell, she took the name Teresa because she was very inspired by Teresa of Avila. And she was noted for being quite intelligent and being very philosophical, and she had quite the love of learning. Now, here's where we get to her escape from Germany and her preparation for martyrdom. So in 1938, Teresa Benedicta was smuggled across the border to the Netherlands to escape the growing Nazi threat. Unfortunately, this safety doesn't last long because the Netherlands falls to Nazi Germany. She believed that she would not survive the war, which is a very pessimistic view, and she began to mentally and physically prepare herself for life in a concentration camp. She did this by starving herself, and she did this by suffering through the cold. So she was like really preparing herself for life in a concentration camp. The looming threat strengthens her faith, and she becomes more committed to Catholicism and the Carmelite order. In 1940, Germany invades and occupies the Netherlands. In 1942, the Dutch Bishops' Conference releases a statement condemning Nazi racism, and this makes the Nazis very unhappy. So they decide to arrest all ethnic Jews who had converted specifically to Catholicism, which includes Edith Stein. So they arrested around 900 Jewish Catholics. And on August 2nd, 1942, Teresa Benedicta was arrested and sent to Amersfoort concentration camp. She was then moved to the Auschwitz death camp, and it's estimated, but we're not entirely sure when exactly she died, but historians believe that she died on the 9th of August. murdered in the gas chamber. And that's the story of Edith Stein.
Questions for Ricky
Yeah, any questions?
as we do a little transition?
If you notice, this was more of a sort of a lecture, not really having to do with anything theological. But yeah, it was more of a just a practical sort of presentation. So I'll go ahead and let you take it. No cause for canonization has been opened for James Edwin Coyle, nor is he recognized as a saint or martyr by the Vatican.
What's left though?
So here's the historical context, right? There was increased immigration to the United States, mostly from Ireland, from Italy, and from Eastern Europe. And a lot of these immigrants, of course, Italy and Ireland are very heavily Catholic nations at this point in time, and a lot of the Eastern European immigrants were actually Eastern European Jews, right? And racism is the norm in the United States. What is this, the 1920s? We're 1915, right there, 1915. So in 1915, racism is the norm in the United States, racism is expected in the United States, and racism is alive and well in the United States, right? We have the rise of the Second Ku Klux Klan. The rise of the Second Ku Klux Klan happened after the release of a movie titled The Birth of a Nation by D.W. Griffith. And this was a movie that was adapted from a book, but essentially that movie portrays the KKK as the good guys who are like these knights in shining armor who are coming to save American society from black people. That is literally the movie, right? But this movie is so effective at like convincing people that this is it, right? That a second Ku Klux Klan is formed in 1915, and at its peak, membership is estimated to be anywhere from 3 million to 8 million people. That is a lot of people. That is a lot of people, right? And like I mentioned earlier, if you weren't a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, they pretty much hated you. And the Second Klan was especially focused on its activities concerning anti-Catholicism and anti-immigrant activity, right? And also the economy is booming in the 1920s because we had just gotten over the First World War. So here we have Father James Coyle. Here's a picture of James Coyle and his sister. She's not really in part of the story, but James Coyle is obviously our main guy that we're focusing on right now. So born in 1837 in the United Kingdom, his birthplace is in modern-day Ireland. But back in the day, England controlled Ireland. So he was technically born in the United Kingdom, but today it's modern-day Ireland. He was ordained a priest at 23 years of age. In 1896, he was assigned to the Diocese of Mobile, Alabama. In 1904, he was appointed as the pastor of St. Paul's Church, which would later become St. Paul's Cathedral. And he was noted for loving his congregation and his congregation loving him. A happy marriage and a tragic death. So Father James had presided over the marriage of Ruth Stevenson, a recent Catholic convert, and a white woman, and Pedro Guzman, who was a dark-skinned Puerto Rican man. The wedding was performed in secret, and there was a reason why it was performed in secret, because back in this day, it was very taboo for a dark-skinned man to marry a white woman. In fact, the threat that came with this, the penalty that came with it, essentially, not by official U.S. law, but by if you got caught, you would probably be lynched if you were a man caught marrying a white woman and you yourself were not white, right? 2 hours after the marriage, an enraged Edwin Stevenson, a Southern Methodist minister and Ruth's father and member of the Ku Klux Klan, stormed into St. Paul's property. Father James was sitting at the front porch of his rectory, and Stevenson shot Father James in the head for facilitating the sacrament of matrimony. And there were many witnesses that saw this, right? So Father James was sitting and minding his own business, literally sitting on the swing on his porch, reading something, when this guy comes up and like just shoots him point blank in the head, right? And Father James was rushed to St. Vincent's Hospital, but died during surgery. Tragically died during surgery. Now here is this really messed me up when I read this. I was reading about what happened during the trial, and essentially Edwin Stevenson was charged with the murder of Father James. But the KKK paid for Stephen's lawyers, and out of the 5 lawyers they hired, 4 of them were also members of the KKK. Judge William Fort presided over the trial, and he was also a member of the KKK. So, yes, exactly, bruh. Imagine that. Imagine that the judge is a member of the KKK, and, like, there's a guy who's charged with the murder, and he's part of the KKK. Obviously, this trial was not fair at all. And the trial was doomed to be a travesty of justice from the start. James Coyle's funeral was described as being one of the largest in Birmingham's history. And Stevenson, unsurprisingly, was found not guilty and faced 0 consequences. The Catholic community would face clan violence for many, many years to come. And on August 11, 2021, St. Paul's Cathedral held a memorial mass in honor of the 100th anniversary of Father James Coyle's murder.